So a lot of Jews converted openly. A lot of Jews said they converted on the surface but didn't convert. They had their secret societies of Judaism carrying on. A lot of them would change their name so they wouldn't sound, they would change their name from Silverberg to Gonzalez, something like that, and so that they would blend in to the Spanish mindset. And this was also going on in Portugal at that time, which is a neighboring country. Now, finally, in 1492, in January, and then it was carried out in March of 1492, that King Ferdinand signs a document saying that all Jews must convert or be expelled immediately. Well, a lot of Jews converted, a lot of Jews left, a lot of Jews were murdered, but the end result was that Spain basically shot itself in the foot financially by getting rid of the Jews. And at that same year, Christopher Columbus in 1492 sailed the ocean blue. Isn't it interesting that God was looking and preparing for a second homeland for the Jews and a way for him to further the gospel the way he wanted it furthered? And again, we talked about that dual covenant, that the Jews have a covenant with God's people now since Jesus went to the cross. Remember, Jesus was a Jew. Remember, all the 12 disciples were Jews. All right? They weren't French people, they weren't Germans, they were Jews. They weren't Italians, they were Jews. So, God is looking for this dual covenant, and the dual covenant, I mean the relationship, the symbiotic relationship that we have with one another that must continue in peace if we're to have a blessing on our lives. Now, the next thing we find out is in 1517 that Martin Luther posts his thesis on the door, actually, of this church in Germany. The Pope wants him to recant. He doesn't recant. He goes through a lot of persecution, but ends up taking off what's known as the protest movement or the Protestant movement, which is a very healthy thing. It sharpens the church and brings back the blessing upon the church. The Spanish Armada occurs in 1585 and 1593, and Spain becomes a second-rate power permanently, never rising again. Predominantly, and we can see it happens over a 200-year period, Spain is losing their wealth predominantly because of how Spain is acting towards the Jews. Christians towards Jews. Remember that. Christians towards Jews. Now, the next thing we see is the Mayflower lands of Plymouth. We see the first legal document of a government because of the Mayflower Compact, and that was just so that the Christians, the Puritans, weren't killed by the sailors and the sailors didn't have any women with them, all right? And the Puritans had all their wives with them. It was to make sure the men weren't murdered, the women weren't taken captive, and whatever, would happen there. So we see the first legal document of government here in this brand new world. And in 1621, the first Thanksgiving. We take it all the way up to 1758. We see that George Washington takes Fort Duquesne, which later becomes Fort Pitt, which later becomes Pittsburgh, and a prophecy is made over him by an Indian saying that stop shooting at that guy. We shot him. We shot his horses out from underneath him. We put bullet holes in his hat and his coat, but we can't take him down. Stop shooting at him, all you other Indians here. Stop shooting at him. He is a man who's to be honored. He's going to be a great man someday. Sure enough, it comes to pass. And he gets to give that prophecy to really the rest of the world 15 years later in his native tongue. We come all the way up into 1775, 1777. We find out that we've signed a Declaration of Independence. And we discovered in the last 100 years, prior to 1775, we've discovered that many of the preachers were also the military leaders. Many of the preachers would go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time for peace and there's a time for war. Quite frankly, friends, I've preached that in a whole lot of services I've done funerals for. I preached that over and over again, and I never saw that literally could have a modern day meaning as I saw it as we were studying this. And one preacher up in New Hampshire, after he was done preaching, took off his black robe and revealed his blue Continental uniform, and he said, "Men to arms," and all the men went home, got their muskets, joined them back at the church, and 70 men went down to Massachusetts to fight with the Continental Army against the British there, and many other churches around the eastern seaboard. It was the pastors who got the men to stand up and fight for righteousness. We found out also that some of the writings of the King of Britain in that day was pro-slavery. Very important thing as we talk about this today. He was pro-slavery, where not only these ministers, but the leaders of our country were anti-slavery. Now, you're not going to read that in a magazine, and you're not going to find that on the internet. You have to read historical documents without them being altered, and I have amassed a giant library, as I've been showing you week after week, and I haven't been repeating the books that I've had up here. I have a significant historical library that goes back 300, 400, 500 years with reprints of original documents, showing that there was a great hatred for slavery and a great understanding that we could not allow this on this new continent. However, it did get some root, as you know, but by 1808, as we see over here, the United States prohibits the importing of slaves from Africa. It doesn't mean that slavery isn't no longer available in America, but now there's something called the Mason-Dixon line. And in that Mason-Dixon line, there was no slavery practiced above that line, and below that line, slavery was allowed. Remember, it wasn't everyone in the South who had a slave. It wasn't 50% of the, we'll call, white people in the South that had a slave. But it was plantation owners only. And there was not that many plantation owners. Plantations were important. But if you're talking numbers-wise, less than 10% of the population of the South only had slaves. And in the North, black people were free. They were called Negroes back in that day, and they were, in fact, in many of the writings, if I read any of them here today, the term Negro is not meant as a disparaging term, but that's the term that was used back in those days. So we find out now, 1808, the USA prohibits the importing of slaves from Africa, but right at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and also when the constitutions of 9 of the northern states were put together, slavery was outlawed at the Constitution that they made for their individual states. Now we come all the way up to 1861, and I want to flip to the next slide, please, if we could. We're going to show Abraham Lincoln here. He was born in 1809, and he died right at the end of his presidency, as many of you know. Abraham Lincoln is most known for what he did as a result, what happened here to the United States and the Civil War. What was the reason for the Civil War? Make no mistake about it, the Civil War was nothing more than God's hand getting rid of the final hangers-on of slavery in this country. Understand again, many things that you would like to have happen overnight take many years historically for God to change things and move things. And as we were looking at that timeline, it took 200 years from the first massacre in Spain for Spain to lose basically all of its wealth and be bankrupt. It takes a long time for these things to come to pass. Change comes slowly when we look at it, in the now, but we can look at it historically. It looks like it's happening very quickly. One of the things that Abraham Lincoln was known for, first of all, he was a lawyer, didn't go to school, but he had a primer that he grew up with. His mother was a Christian. And although Abraham Lincoln said, listen to this now very carefully, Abraham Lincoln said he was not a Christian until he was midway through his presidency, and I'll read you some quotes on that. However, when I say someone isn't a Christian back then as compared to someone not being a Christian today, we've got to take into account the mindset of today and the mindset back then. I have in front of me two primers that were used, that were both of these were printed in 1824. Both of them are reprints, they're not the originals. And one of them was printed, one of these actually is a reprint in 1914. And I have a lot of books here that were reprinted in 1914 for some reason. Okay. These books, one of this is the track primer for students by the American Track Society. It says by the American Track Society in here. The other one is a primer for children. When I say primer, this is the only teaching book that children had in grades roughly 1 through 8 to 1 through 10. These are the books that they used. These are the books that parents would use if the parents had the book themselves.